The Ukraine war has already left a deep mark on modern history. It reshaped alliances, revived NATO, pushed Russia closer to China, and made the world fear once again that humanity could be on the edge of a global war. But what if the conflict in Ukraine did not remain limited? What if it grew beyond borders and escalated into a full-scale World War III, pulling in the United States, Russia, NATO, China, and dozens of other countries? To imagine this alternate scenario, we must first go back to 2022, when Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine. Moscow expected a swift victory. Instead, it faced fierce resistance from Ukraine and massive support from the West. Billions of dollars in weapons flowed in. Intelligence sharing became constant, and sanctions were piled against Russia. The world quickly divided into two camps. The Western alliance on one side, Russia with limited but strategic partners on the other. The balance was fragile. In our alternate timeline, one decision changes everything. NATO does not limit itself to providing weapons and training. Instead, NATO sends aircraft to enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine. This decision is seen in Moscow as direct aggression. Russia declares that NATO has entered the war. Within days, the conflict escalates into something far larger than anyone had imagined. The United States deploys additional combat troops to Poland and the Baltic states. Russia mobilizes hundreds of thousands of soldiers, shifting its economy fully into wartime production. For the first time since World War II, Europe becomes the center of a continent-wide war. The first battles of World War III would likely erupt in Eastern Europe. Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia would become major targets for Russian missile strikes, while NATO forces would respond with counterattacks deep into Russian territory. The skies would be filled with fighter jets and drones, while the ground would see massive armoured battles across thousands of kilometres. The Black Sea would become a deadly battlefield, where NATO fleets and Russia's navy fight for control. But unlike previous world wars, this one would not remain on land and sea alone. The cyber battlefield would be just as destructive. Power grids, banking systems, and satellites would be attacked. Imagine entire American cities without electricity, European economies paralyzed by cyber sabotage, or Russia's communications networks collapsing under Western cyber offensives. This invisible front could cause as much chaos as bombs and missiles. At the same time, the war would not remain confined to Europe. China would carefully watch the situation. If Beijing saw Washington too deeply tied down in Europe, it might take the opportunity to move on Taiwan, opening a second global front. This would force the United States to divide its resources across two oceans. In our alternate timeline, World War III would not just be NATO versus Russia, but a multipolar conflict involving the greatest powers of the modern era. Other nations would be pulled in as well. Iran could use the chaos to expand its influence in the Middle East. Turkey might try to assert control in its region, balancing between NATO obligations and its own ambitions. India would face enormous pressure to pick a side, while countries in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia would be caught in the global economic storm. This war would not simply be about armies, it would affect the entire planet. The global economy would collapse almost immediately. Trade routes through the Black Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the South China Sea would be disrupted. Oil prices would skyrocket. Food shortages would spread as Ukrainian and Russian grain exports disappear. Inflation, unemployment, and economic depression would hit every corner of the world. For billions of people, survival itself would become uncertain. Refugees would flood across borders in numbers never seen before. And then comes the darkest possibility, the use of nuclear weapons. If Russia faced the threat of defeat on the battlefield, it could deploy tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine or against NATO forces in Poland. The world would hold its breath. NATO's leaders would face the most difficult decision in human history. Should they respond in kind or risk total destruction by escalating further? In our alternate timeline, once one nuclear weapon is used, the barrier of fear is broken. Within hours, cities across Europe and Russia could be reduced to ashes. If escalation continued, intercontinental nuclear weapons could strike New York, Moscow, London, Paris, Beijing, and Washington. The modern world as we know it would cease to exist. But what if the war stayed just below the nuclear threshold? Even then, the destruction would be unimaginable. Conventional battles would devastate entire nations. Infrastructure would be shattered. Economies would collapse into depression. Global warming would accelerate as oil fields burned and cities were destroyed. Political systems would fall apart. Hundreds of millions of lives could be lost through war, famine, disease, and chaos. The 21st century would become an age of ruin, just as the 20th was shaped by World War II. In this alternate history, the Ukraine war becomes the spark that ignites the greatest conflict humanity has ever seen. It shows how a local struggle left unchecked can expand into a global catastrophe. It is a warning about how fragile peace truly is, and how quickly miscalculation, pride, and fear can push humanity over the edge. So the final question remains, is this only a nightmare scenario, or are we closer to it than we think? And what must we, as a global civilization, learn from history to ensure that World War III never becomes our reality?